Welcome to Windy Night Stories. The night is coming on, and the wind is rising. It's time for a story, and tonight's story is by Henry Tinson, Under the Sheer Legs. I never heard of a man who had seen a ghost on a railway, till the instance which I am about to relate, though I don't know why ghosts should not be as plentiful on railways as anywhere else. Having for many years been assistant storekeeper at the London end of the direct meridian, I consider the locality of a locomotive depot favorable for ghosts. The long, gloomy sheds and empty workshops, with uncouth machinery lying about, and enormous engines imperfectly seen in the dim light, were, after dark, as vague and full of mystery as any old monastery or castle could ever be, and it was difficult to put your foot on a spot where some poor fellow had not been killed, or where, if an old hand, as I was, you could not remember to have spoken to some stalwart driver or fireman before he started on the journey from which he never came back. Yet we had no ghosts about the place. In a few years we had a great change on the direct meridian. One of our principals retired, and his successor was a man who had risen from the ranks. Now this rising from the ranks is all very fine in theory, but on a railway, at any rate, it does not answer. The men dislike serving their old mates, who when promoted are often tyrants, taking a delight in going into 1,000 little matters, which a gentleman would never notice, and making the service almost intolerable. Or else they are good kindly men enough, but obliged to see with others' eyes and hear with others' ears. Our new chief was one of the latter description, a most amiable man, who did more mischief among his staff, and whose name was used to sanction more injustice in the first 12 months after his appointment, than would probably have been the case under a martinet in 7 years. To our station, which being in London was of course a very important one, a new superintendent was sent, by name Ewells. He, too, had risen from the ranks, and the men who had fancied the previous gaffer, as chiefs were called on railways, a strict hand, soon found the difference to their cost. The worst feature about this new master was his treachery. He would talk to the drivers in a hearty, hail fellow, well met sort of way, that at first made them think there was never such a man, and he would promise his influence to get them everything they wanted. But engine drivers are a shrewd class, and it was soon discovered that, no matter what Ewells said, if he did not have his own way, or was not sufficiently cringed to, there was always some difficulty, never seeming to arise from him, however, which postponed a man's requests, or got him into serious trouble. The old drivers, a set of North countrymen, didn't care for him or any living thing, and would as soon have gone and told the board of his tyranny as have smoked their pipes. This he knew, and avoided them accordingly. But towards the younger or more timid drivers, he was both deceitful and severe. Sim Fern suffered about the most from him. Sim was a poor, easy-tempered, nervous fellow, exactly the sort of man that Ewells could terrorize. I am within bounds when I say that for 3 months Sim, who was a good driver, never made a trip that he was not found fault with and bullied, for Ewells did not find it necessary to be smooth-faced with him. His nature was to bully, and he indulged it with all those he could frighten. And he did frighten Sim. I have seen the poor fellow wipe the tears from his eyes, with the clean cotton waist I had just given him, when he is about to start with his train, and he has said, "Mr. Sayers, he means my ruin. I shall be sacked without a character, and then what will become of my children?" For he had 5 pretty little children, and I think when he used to see the 3 elder toddle off to Sunday school, while he took the other 2 for a bit of a walk, he was the proudest and happiest of engine drivers. Of course I did my best to cheer him up, but everybody knew that what he said was true, and that, do what he would never do right. At last poor Sim took to drinking, and came on duty once or twice obviously the worse for beer. Ewells positively chuckled at this, and if the driver had got into scrapes before, you may be sure he did not keep out of them now. He learnt from a youth, Bill Soames' son, Bill Soames was another driver, and his boy was in the office with Mr. Ewells, that his train tickets had a closer examination than those of the other drivers, and that every trivial discrepancy in his entries was looked into and censured, while the others, except a few timid fellows like himself, they were passed over. It was dreadful to see how nervous Sim grew. His fireman has told me, over and over again, how he would sob like a child while talking of the persecution he suffered, and how he would wish he was dead, and offer up strange, wild prayers while on the journey. It would take me too long to tell all the mischief Ewells worked among the men, and the dislike and dread everybody came to have of him. As storekeeper, I did not come much in contact with him, and as so long as I kept things pretty straight, he had not much temptation to meddle with me. Things had gone on in this manner for some months. 2 of our drivers had been dismissed, 2 or 3 had left for other lines, and many had been fined. Among the latter was Sim, who had been fined so repeatedly for coming on duty intoxicated that he would have been discharged, only Ewells liked to play with a mouse, before he killed it. I remember very well one wet and windy afternoon about the beginning of February, when Sim came into my office for his stores, as he was booked out to take the 6:30 train. He had been drinking as usual, and in the pocket of the rough jacket he wore over his slop I saw a small bottle, which I knew he had carried of late, full of gin. I was getting his stores together, when young Soames ran in with a message for me from Mr. Ewells. "Hello, Sim," he exclaimed, seeing the driver. "You are in for it again. Mr. Ewells will be down on you this time." "He always is down on me," said Sim. "I often wish I was a convict, or that he was." "Well," said the young one, "I saw a letter on his desk, half finished, to Mr. naming the chief. He is reporting you nicely, and I expect you'll have the sack. I'm off early tonight, for I'm going to the play." And with that the youngster scampered away. Poor Sim said nothing, but looked at me as if he would look me through. I have seen but one man hanged, and will take care I never see another, but the look the poor wretch gave all around him when he came upon the scaffold was just like the desperate, hopeless look Sim Fern gave me. Then he went off to his engine, for he was always early. He did all he could to keep straight with his masters, and was often in the shed 20 minutes before his fireman, although it was the latter's duty to be there first. About 25 minutes, or perhaps half an hour after this, as I was thinking of locking up, one of our fitters ran in, with his face as white as a sheet, and said, "Mr. Sayers, by George, Mr. Ewells is killed. He is smashed to bit at the end of the shops." Staying for nothing after hearing this, I ran out of the stores, with no need to ask where the accident was, for every man and boy was running out of the shops towards the shear legs. The shear legs is an enormous tripod formed by 3 massive poles, united at the top, and strong enough to bear our heaviest engines, which, when repairs to the lower parts are needed, are swung under the legs by powerful chains, resting only on their fore or hind wheels, as the case may be. These chains are worked by a crab, which is very easily turned by a couple of men at the handles, and when the end of the engine is hauled up as high as is wanted, a bolt or pin is thrust into the wheel of the crab and holds it from running down. It was, of course, pitch dark, but the lanterns from the shed and the portable gas lamps from the shops showed a crowd of 60 or 70 grimy fellows around the legs. The foremen were shouting their directions, and everyone seemed scared. They made way for me, however, and I saw at once what had happened. Mr. Ewells had got under the engine, which was easy enough to do, probably to examine it, and while there, by some unaccountable mischance, the pin of the crab had given way, and the tremendous weight of the locomotive, the mastodon, one of our heaviest goods machines, had fallen upon him and crushed him to death at once. His head and face, strangely enough, had escaped uninjured, and while his body was utterly smashed by the fore part of the engine, for the front wheels were off, and it was the chimney end which had come down with such a fearful run, his head, with its staring eyes and bushy red whiskers, protruded from under the framing, and seemed to be looking at us, with a horrible grin about the mouth which almost turned me sick. The first thing to be done was to lift the engine, and a couple of powerful screw jacks, as they are termed, were at once placed under it, near the hind wheels. The foremen were busy in directing the laborers and keeping the crowd back, when the timekeeper and I left. We thought we might as well go into the dead man's office, see that nothing of consequence was lying about, and lock the room. It appeared that before Mr. Ewells had gone his usual round, he had been burning his papers, for there was not a scrap of a letter of any kind, whether written or received by him, to be seen on his desk, while in the fender, quite cold and black, was a heap of tinder which had recently been paper. This we noticed, and then, locking the office door, went home. At the inquest, no one could account for the bolt slipping from the cogs, but the general opinion was that it had not been pushed fairly home by the fitters who lifted the engine. This they strenuously denied, and argued that it would not have held all day unless they had done so. But it was said, in reply, that any accidental jar might have loosened it a little, and then the immense weight of the engine had pulled it down. At any rate, there was no doubt how Mr. Ewells was killed, and a verdict of accidental death was returned. Nothing was ever heard of the report against Fern, and while the new superintendent had his own likings and dislikings, as they all have, he did not meddle much with Sim. I saw the latter pretty often, for he had to come to me for his stores, and I was of the opinion with the men that Sim was going mad. Not only did he drink as much as before, but he grew very wild in his talk, and this not from drink. From some cause or other, the liquor he took never seemed to affect him now as it had once done. He never seemed tipsy, and although he talked strangely, it was not as a drunken man talks. You could always excite him by speaking of Ewells. I have said that Fern was a quiet, timid fellow. He was so, more than any man I ever saw, but if someone mentioned our late gaffer, he would rave about him, cursing and swearing so that it turned my very blood, though I had heard a great deal of bad language in my time. But the strangest of all was the queer way in which he used to mutter to himself about the dead master. When anything started the subject accidentally, he would go on growling and muttering as if he could see Ewells standing by his side. So, at last, from one thing and another, poor Fern, instead of being the most popular man about the place, became to be so disliked and avoided that none of his mates cared to speak to him. This hurt him very much, I could see, but it was not to be wondered at, and the only man who really stuck to him was his fireman, Dick Farmer. Fern had once done Dick a great service, and Dick never forgot it, and in proportion as others cooled, these two grew more friendly. In fact, the fireman twice fought men in the field at the back of our engine shed for insulting Sim. Neither of his antagonists came to work for a week afterwards. Well, things had gone on as much as usual for, I suppose, 8 or 9 months, when, on a drizzling, miserable December evening, I had to take a message to the coke stage, which was about 1/4 of a mile below my stores, and coming back, I had to pass the shear legs to get to the back of the shops. It was about 6 o'clock, and the drizzling rain was blown in my face by a bitter wind. It was very dark, too, but so many lights were about that no part was so black but that you could see to pick your way, and see the wet glistening on the metals. I had just reached the corner of the shops when an irresistible impulse made me turn round to look at the shear legs. I had passed them just before, and they were not more than 50 yards from where I stood. I knew that an engine was half suspended there, as was nearly always the case, but something made me turn round again. I saw the gigantic beams very distinctly, for a grate full of coals was burning close by, lighted by some men who were coming to work on the rails, and the shear legs were between me and the glare. There hung the black, enormous locomotive, and below it, just where the front wheels had been, stood a man in a tall hat and a long greatcoat. I started with surprise, for the figure could not have been there a moment before, as I could have sworn, and there was something so horribly familiar in its outline that after I had instinctively moved towards it, I recoiled in terror. I was collected enough, though I felt the drops of cold sweat on my forehead, to remember how accidental combinations of familiar objects, or changes in their position, had often imposed upon and terrified men, and I moved first to the right, and then to the left, to see if by doing so I disturbed the figure. Not a bit. It was still there, and as I looked, took off its hat, and passed its hand through its hair, with a manner that was the manner of Mr. Ewells who was killed. And the figure was Mr. Ewells, as I had known him many months before. There he stood beneath the engine, and looked up at the monstrous mass hanging above him, just as Ewells must have looked up a moment before the iron avalanche crushed him. So certain was I that it was Ewells, and so certain at the same time that it could not be him, that I feared my brain was affected, and I turned my eyes away from the sight with the same difficulty that a bird, as we are told, turns from the gaze of a serpent. I was conscious that I staggered in my walk, and almost dreaded lest my imagination should conjure up another spectre, when a voice on the bank by my side aroused me. "Well, Mr. Sayers, you have seen him at last, then." The voice was that of Sim Fern, and it broke the spell. I looked round again, and there hung the locomotive, there the tall legs reared themselves, but all was black, motionless, and void beneath them. Sim was descending a path down the slope, one by which the drivers often came to their work, and as I looked up at him, I saw that he was perfectly sober and serious. "Seen whom, Sim?" I exclaimed, feeling as I spoke that I would rather have met anyone at that moment than Fern. "Seen Ewell, sir," returned the driver. "Why, what do you mean?" I asked, not at all liking to own what I thought I'd seen. "Don't be offended, sir," continued Sim. "If I say that it is of no use, you're trying to deceive me. Ewell's walks there every night, I believe. I have seen him 20 times at least, but I did not think that any other eyes than mine could see him." "Why not, Fern? Why should you—" I began, but he resumed, without seeming conscious of what I was saying. "He means something, Mr. Sayers. Depend upon it, by his showing himself to a second party. It is a warning. I always come this way when it is my turn to take my train after dark, because if I did not come and see him at the legs, I know he would come and see me." "My good fellow," I said, "you are ill. You are not fit to take out your train. Go home now, lay up a day or two, and you will get your mind to rights." "Is your mind wrong, Mr. Sayers?" returned Fern. "You know what you saw just now, and you are above denying it, sir. You are quite aware that you saw Ewell's under the engine. So did I, and, curse him, it is not the first time I have seen him there, the cowardly brute, and well he knows it. But good night, sir. I am all right. Don't you forget that I said it was a warning." He disappeared behind the building, and I returned to the stores, dwelling more on his strange manner and stranger words than even on the mysterious appearance which I had witnessed. I determined to question Sim a little more when he fetched his stores, but his fireman came for them, and while I was attending to him, said, "It's a queer job, this, about the engines, sir. I wish we had knowed it earlier." "What's wrong about them, farmer?" I asked. "Why, don't you know they have changed our engines?" exclaimed the man. "The Colossus got a leaky tube, and so they have given us the Mastodon, the engine that killed Mr. Ewell's." "Good heaven!" I ejaculated, almost involuntarily. "Yes, it's very unlucky," continued the fireman. "If I had known it before, Sim should never have—" Here he checked himself, as though afraid of saying too much, and bidding me good night, he left, as I did, almost immediately after. I had some doubt about telling my wife what I had seen. However, I decided upon doing so, and found she considered it, using the very words of Fern, a warning. And for myself, I hardly knew what to think of it at all, and lay awake half the night, nervous and excited. In the morning I went to work, and as I passed the policeman at the gate, he said, "A bad job, Mr. Sayers, about poor Fern." "Why, what has happened?" I returned, and felt myself trembling all over. "Killed, sir, last night, before he had got 20 miles on the road. He was under the engine, oiling her, for she had not been running for some time before, while they were in the goods siding at Baybridge. And by some accident, which nobody can understand, she slipped forward a little, the connecting rod struck him on the head, and of course killed him directly." I stopped to hear no more, but went on to the stores, where everybody was full of the accident, and in the course of the morning farmer returned, another driver and fireman having gone on with the train. Dick was very much distressed at the loss of his comrade, concerning whose death he gave just the account as I had already heard. He could only suggest, in explanation, that the train had been brought to a stand on an incline. Some of the hinder trucks must have slipped a little, and so given an impetus, which moved everything slightly. And this theory was eventually adopted at the inquest. Farmer soon afterwards gave notice to leave, as he had obtained an engagement on an Indian railway, where he did very well. In fact, he was a first-rate hand, and is now a foreman on the line he joined. I never mentioned what I had seen, but just before he left, Dick came to me and said that poor Sim had spoken a good deal about me on that last trip, and told him that I had seen the ghost of Ewell's. I admitted this, as I was sure there was more to be told, and then Dick went on to say that from the moment Sim found he was to drive the Mastodon, he coupled that fact with my having seen the ghost, and made up his mind that he should never come back alive. If he really were killed, Dick was to be at liberty to tell me, as the only other person to whom the spirit of Ewell's had appeared, what Dick had long known, that Sim had, in a fit of desperation, caused the death of the superintendent. Sim had seen him standing under the engine, examining it with his lamp. No one was near, and all his insults and tyranny rushing at once to the driver's excited mind, he pulled out the bolt from the crab and let the engine down with a run. He had then gone into the office and burnt every scrap of writing he could see on Yule's table, so that nothing should remind his successor of the report against himself. All this Dick had long known, but would assuredly rather have died than reveal it, save at Sim's desire. Even now, it was perfectly clear that he failed to see any great harm in the murder of Mr. Ewells. I kept the secret until I left the line, but now I venture to tell it and to declare, doubt it who may, that I have seen a railway ghost. The end.